Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our virtual town hall on education. Today, we'll be unpacking the education crisis, not only in South Africa, but in Gauteng in particular. Joining me today is our premier candidate and our provincial leader, Solium Simanga. And we are also joined by an expert in the field. We are joined today by Prof. Jansen. And I'd actually just like to start by asking Prof. Jansen, what is it? What is the lay of the land? What is the current situation with education in South Africa?
Well, if you're talking about school education, first of all, we've got a massive crisis around which there's a lot of dishonesty. And so, unfortunately, we measure our success, and the public has gotten to, much of the public has gotten to assume that the matric results tells you about something about the state of the health of the school system. It's a lie. It's not true. I study systems of education around the world. The last thing you do is to wait for the grade 12 or the final year, the exit year of school, and then make assumptions about what's happening in grades 1, 2, and 3. So we know, for example, that about half the kids who started in grade 2 don't get to grade 12. Excuse me. To begin with, we know that. We know that the pass requirement, 30%, 40% in grade 12 is extremely low. In other words, it's not difficult actually to get those who do make it over the line. And we do know that in the subject that matters most around the world, almost all professions, mathematics, there's been a gross migration of kids in all provinces, including the one I'm sitting now, the Western Cape, to mathematical literacy, which is not serious math. So for some reason, we think that there's a 70 or 80% pass rate for the few that made it, that this is significant. And this is a real tragedy because when South Africa is measured, as you know, against international tests of comparison, we always appear last or second last and so on and so forth. So it's a great tragedy, that we have fooled ourselves into thinking that the school system is doing well. No. And just the other day, by the way, yet again, a little child, drowning in his own ship in one of his latrine toilets. It's disgusting that there isn't more outrage about that state of the school system.
Thank you very much, Prof. And Solly, I think if there's one thing you can do right now is to really unpack what it is that we find ourselves dealing with in Gauteng as it pertains to the education sector. Can you do that for us?
Well, I think picking up from where the prof left, I think there's quite a number of things that we need to be talking to. First of all, we need to be talking to the infrastructure. You cannot talk about the quality of education and delivering quality education if you cannot talk about the quality infrastructure that is needed. In Gauteng, we're still sitting with schools that have asbestos. You're still sitting with schools, you go to your areas like Hammanskraal, where learners are still using the bucket system, to go to toilets. That is a big challenge. You're having ceilings that are falling apart in certain schools where kids have been, injured. Because the infrastructure is actually then falling apart. So I think that's where we also now need to look at to then say, do we have adequate infrastructure? And the answer is no, we don't have adequate infrastructure in Gauteng to be able to then ensure that there is quality education that is provided. So you have infrastructure that is falling apart. We haven't really built enough schools to accommodate the population inflow that is coming into Gauteng. That is another challenge. You are now sitting with teachers that on average have to be looking at between 50 and 70 kids. That is not sustainable. You cannot have quality education and give quality attention to kids when you're having 60, 70 kids in a classroom, where you're having windows that are broken, when you're having, in certain instances, learners that are learning in containers, that have holes in them. And that is really not going to assist. And Prof also speaks about, the kind of teaching and quality that we are now supposed to be getting in school, that is also not only to provide quality of education, but to also ensure that your kids are staying in schools and then completing. Gauteng is losing 200,000 learners a year. Through the schooling system. And there's a number of contributing factors. One of those has been, that learners have just been pushed through the system without adequate, assessments being done in terms of the quality of education and whether the curriculum is what the kids are actually able to then cope with. These are some of the things that we have been saying we now need to be dealing with. We need to be dealing with whether, assessments on an ongoing basis where kids can be assessed on whether they are able to then cope with the curriculum that has been given to them. And if they're not, what is then the alternative? The alternative could be that they need vocational school. They need, other kind of education instead of, the reading and writing as you and me would, know reading and writing. And these are some of the things that in Gauteng has been a major challenge and hasn't been really dealt with, and I think needs to be dealt with.
Now, on that issue, we actually, when you look at the entire education sector, you've got to try and understand what some of the core issues are that face our learners in our schools. And one thing that you touched on there, Solly, was the issue of overcrowding. And I want to swing it back to you, Prof. Regarding overcrowding, we know that it has a lot of negative impacts on our schooling system, but we also have to take into consideration various other aspects, such as how do we ensure that there's a provision of furniture? How do we ensure that there's a provision of space to actually learn in? So, Prof, can you touch on what exactly it is that the impacts of overcrowding are, how we can go about defining it, and what eventual solutions to overcrowding might be?
Yeah, you have very limited solutions to overcrowding. Let me start there. In the 80% of the schools that don't work in our country. And the reason for that is, A, there's been massive budget cuts in all the provinces, in line with what's happening in other state departments, as you know, as a result of Treasury's instruction. So it's not like there's going to be more classrooms built and more teachers provided. In fact, there are provinces in which, including the one in which I sit right now, in which there's been, circulars to encourage to instruct around fewer teachers, and that's simply because of budgets, right? So that's a problem. The second thing is, nobody really cares if a teacher in a Khayelitsha or in, Orange Farm, such as 50 years, or Ganubi, where I saw this myself, 90 kids in a classroom. Nobody really cares if the poor, don't watch them. That would create havoc in middle class and upper middle class schools. But what advantage do they have? The parents can pay for what is called governing body posts. In other words, they can pay for 5, 6, 10 teachers to come in, so that the children of the middle classes can have 20 kids in a class or 18 kids in a class, etc., etc. So I don't know what the solution there is, but what I do know is we have not yet had a government that prioritizes the education of the 80%, except for these gimmicks, as I said, in grade 12, 10, 11, 12. And until that happens, and especially in the early childhood years, which is really where, our government doesn't fully fund early childhood education. In fact, one of the projects I'm involved in right now looks to the corporate sector to work with, with the government's ECB program to cobble together something. And it makes me mad, because all the research is clear about one thing. And educational research is seldom clear about anything, but it's clear about one thing, that if you invest in the education of the youngest children, those benefit socially and individually and domestically for families sustain themselves for a number of years. But we go to the wrong end of the pipeline. We try and fix things at grade 12, put kids in camps. Even I'm going to camps these days because of a school I'm involved in. It's the wrong end of the pipeline. So I don't see a solution unless you have a government, or the kind of government that says it is unacceptable as a matter of principle to have more than 25 or 30 kids in a classroom, and therefore we will shift the budgets accordingly. In the present situation, I don't see that happening at all, simply because people don't care.
Thank you very much, Prof. Look, Solly, you become the Premier, and you have to, tackle all of these priorities that we've enlisted. And one of them, of course, is education. How do you address something like overcrowding? As Premier, how would you ensure that we address something like overcrowding within our schools?
Well, this talks to what I've been talking a lot on, and that is, your infrastructure. What is the infrastructure master plan? We're talking about building houses. We're talking about building, social amenities, clinics, and all of that. you cannot talk about human settlement if you're not going to be bringing all these other things together, schools being a big part of them. And what we have been seeing, especially in your predominantly poor communities, is that there is a call it a stereotypical thinking of saying education that happens in your former model school will be better than the education that you get, for instance, in a township. And therefore, you have a serious outflow of learners that are coming from, say the townships into your former Model C areas, into towns, as an example. So you have kids that are coming from Atteridgeville now going to, to your Pretoria Eastern, to your CBD schools. Kids who are supposed to be, for instance, going to Soulridge High School or to WF and Nkomo now, wanting to go to your Girls High, wanting to go to your Glen High and all of that because of the perception that is there. And a number of things create that perception. One is the issue of, infrastructure being better. Two is access to curriculum, that you would not otherwise have had in your township, i.e., or extracurriculum activities. In your former Model C schools, you still have things like, sports, as an example, which you don't get in most township schools. That's a reality. There's also an issue about the political influence that seems to be playing a bigger role in township schools versus those that are former Model C schools. And therefore, when you start then understanding why kids will end up going to such schools and then leaving infrastructure behind, which should actually then be used to then avoid the issue of overcrowding. This is something that for me is a big thing that we want to then address. And the solution to that from where I'm sitting is that we now need to then make sure that we are able to then introduce more facilities closer to where people are staying. So build more schools, fix more schools, extend on the schooling that is there, to ensure that you're able to, accommodate as many kids, but not only cram kids into a school, but be able to then provide enough teachers, be able to then instill a sense of discipline in each and every school, but also ensure that ultimately you are able to provide the quality of education, the same amount of teacher to learner ratio and time, whether you are in a suburban school or whether you are in a township school. That's what we now need to be talking to. The other thing I think that needs to then improve, or that we want to then work around, is the ability to introduce or train more teachers that are able to then provide a variety of subjects and curricula versus what we have been able to then see, where you're having a limited number of teachers having to expand themselves over and over. It creates fatigue, it creates poorer quality of education that is provided out there, but ultimately it ends up having a situation where the learners are not having the full benefit of having a teacher that has speciality, that is able to then give them the time and the attention that they need to be able to then do what needs to be done. So I think that's what needs to be done. We now need to then look at where the special planning is, what kind of infrastructure is available, what can we do to improve on that infrastructure, also to introduce or to bring in more resources in terms of your teacher assistants to those schools, and bring some of the curriculum activities that are missing in some of the schools, which parents are also looking for to be able to then give to their children. As I said, we grew up doing sports where I went to school. That has now died down. You go to school, kids go there, sit the whole day and then go home. That is not enough. That is not a wholesome learning experience that kids are supposed to be getting. And this is why parents will use their feet or vote with their feet and go take their kids to certain schools, which create a problem of overcrowding there as well. We now need to then say, what is the infrastructure looking like in the areas where people find themselves? What is the quality that is being provided there? What is the resources in terms of human capital that is available there? What is the assistance that government can ensure that these teachers and this infrastructure is getting to be able to then give them the quality?
Now, something that you speak to there is the holistic education experience. It's the entirety of education. It's governance, it is infrastructure, it's recreation, it's curriculum, it's all of these things. Now, Prof, I want to know, what is it that the research is saying regarding the holistic educational experience? And then what is the research saying about long-term exposure to the opposite, to an experience that isn't holistic, where you are lacking in certain aspects of this experience? What is the research telling us, and what can we take from that research as we apply it into policy?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of research and even more common sense on what Solly is saying. By the way, I'm very impressed with, I don't belong to your party and I don't intend to belong to your party, but I have to say I'm very impressed with Solly's grasp of the issues in education. Most politicians just talk out of their backside, when it comes to education. But I'm very impressed with your knowledge of the sector. Let me just say this: what we do know from the literature is that not all children are good at the same thing, right? So a child might be average in physics and math, for example, but be a star soccer player or a star athlete, And that is interesting because that means the motivation levels go up. Because I might not stand up in the class in my subject, but guess what? I've just, won the robotics competition, and I'm very, very supportive of a broad curriculum. And by the way, it is only fair that if let me just talk from where I live now after many years, it's only fair if a child at Westford or Stellenbosch boys can get access to all of these, that a child in London or a child in Pontyville must have exactly the same opportunity. Okay? So if you see the world through the perspective of fairness, okay, then what Sally says makes absolute sense. But there's also a utilitarian argument you can make here. When children there's a school here in Mitchell's Bay. It's an absolutely fascinating school. I'm so sorry the principal there is going to retire soon, Owen Bridges at Mondale. The school normally, they just had the athletics competition. The school wins like by 200 points. But what this principal does, he says, I can give you two things. I can give you a top academic education, but I can also give you a top sports program. Guess what? The parents send their children there, okay? Because they want that balance. But also, I'm working at a school right now, which I'm really enjoying. So it's about half of my day there before I go back to Stellenbosch University. And what is very, very interesting is you can't actually keep children for 6 hours, 7 hours in the class, real bad, right? You got to give them offloading, distractions, other things to do. And so everything that Salih says is so right with regard to an expanded curriculum, psychologically, socially, culturally, etc. It makes good sense.
So, in light of that, you tend to mention in various radio interviews and interviews itself that when we look at schooling itself, we acknowledge that different learners have different talents and different fields in which they can excel. Now, as a provincial government, if you are to step into that role, how is it that we actually take advantage of the fact that people have different talents in different fields? For example, you'd have a learner who's good technically and you'd have a learner that's good mathematically. How would you actually leverage this from a provincial government perspective?
Well, I think there's quite a number of things that you can do. One of that is the what do you call it? The school evaluation authorities that you can establish, and this is what I would want to advocate for. When I grew up, there used to be something that we used to call inspectors that will come into school to assess the grasp of learners to of the curriculum, but we'll also look at the teachers' ability to then provide quality teaching and learners getting that quality. And you will find that the inspectors then used to then be able to randomly decide or choose kids within the class and then see whether there is actually a problem with how the teacher is presenting or how the learners are then able to then grasp what is being taught. And you would find that the kids who were struggling academically would be picked up much earlier on. And therefore, a report will be compiled in order to then inform not only the school, but the teacher, not only the school, but the parents as well, to then say, look, this is a problem that is, coming. You pick that earlier on. You provide the parents and the teacher with the relevant information. You are able to then assist that child early on, and through, obviously, this information that they will be able to then say, what is other avenues that are available? Can we look at vocational schooling as an example? Are we able to then look at maybe technical technical learning as an area that can be explored? You do that and also provide infrastructure for that, because right now technical schools are a dying thing in across South Africa. We need to bring that back. We need to bring vocational schooling. We need to bring technical schools back. We need to then say, well, if a child is not able or coping with the academic curriculum that is being provided, are we able to then provide something there? That's what we want to do in government. And as I said, take the politics out, because then you will not have inspectors coming in if politics are always there, because the politicians in schooling are always saying, well, they're coming to spy on us, they're coming to to try and make us do extra work and all of that. That should not be the case. The case should be that you want to be able to then see what the teachers are doing. Is the 210 minimum days a year provided adequately? Is the curriculum covered fully? Are the learners able to then grasp this? Are they able to read and write for meaning when they're doing what we call the STEM? We're looking at the science, the technology, the science, technology, engineering, and maths. If you are going to go that route, are the learners really grasping it? Are they able to then compete with the best in the world if you were to then start looking at it going forward? You do that. You look at those things. You look at the infrastructure that is provided for learners. You look at the valuation from an early age going forward. Once you have all these things in place, I promise you will be able to then pick up if there are challenges and there are problems. You will be able to then intervene from a government perspective, from a schooling perspective, SGB, if you would like to then get them on. The parents are able to be informed of what is happening, are able to then take better decision in terms of what happens with the future of their children. And I think if we're able to then address that, we'll do a number of things. You'll have less dropouts out from school. You'll have better quality education that is provided. You will also ultimately bring in, learners that are skilled at the end of the day, whether they're coming through vocational school, technical school, or the normal academic schools that we're talking to. That is something that needs to be looked at. And I think this is what has been missing for the longest of time in South African education.
And what we're looking at there is really something that speaks to having a broader curriculum, a curriculum that actually accommodates for all of these things so that we can actually see positive outcomes from all of this. And Prof, I want to bring it back to something that you said you have a keen interest on, which is actually this notion of having a more broad-based curriculum. And I want to know, how is it that we can adapt and evolve this that we currently have in terms of policy regarding curriculum to ensure that we actually negate the effects of dropouts, so that we ensure that there are less dropouts within our entire schooling system, especially when you consider things such as a vast amount of these dropouts taking place just as learners are about to enter grade 10, 11, and 12. How is it that we can really adapt what it is that we currently have as a curriculum to ensure that we fight against dropouts?
Well, I think firstly, and again, I've been happy to be involved in these very discussions at the school I'm involved in at the moment. The first thing you do is you look at your curriculum and you do an analysis. So this is, not everything can be solved with the provincial or the national government. And you say, do we have, for the schools that we're working with here, do we have the right mix of subjects, right? That will be interesting for these children, but also intellectually demanding at the same time. And you look at that and sort of say, okay, I'm in an area here, do I really want to do accountancy or do I want to do tourism? Just to give you one example. Do I have, secondly, so you look at your mix and match, right? Secondly, do I have a rich extracurricular program? So I'm working with some foundations for the moment, for example, who would say, okay, there's the math and science in the class, which in most places in the world is fairly boring. But let's have a robotics program. No kid should actually pass school and university, by the way, unless they know something about AI, unless they know something about robotics, unless they know something. I mean, these are basic things, right? And so a kid might fall asleep in the class, but I can tell you now, they're not going to fall asleep after school if there's a rich robotics program. And there's a lot of foundations working with this at the moment. And by the way, some provincial departments also introduce this, okay? The third thing, and this is very important in terms of learner retention, it doesn't help to tell a kid to go to school. In fact, the Bella Bill even threatens to put parents in prison or give them a fine if they don't send their kids to school, which is the most stupid thing you can ever imagine, because where I work right now, you know, there are parents that might already be in prison. It's just like a middle class sort of view of the world, you know, that is so ridiculous. But if you're going to say to a kid, go to school, make it worth their while when they get there. Because you see, it's not just that kids come to school because of the pressure from the parents. Very often they are also pushed out of school because we as teachers aren't teaching consistently. We don't plan our lessons meticulously. We don't make the pedagogy, that is the mode of teaching, exciting. I'm teaching grade 9, the periodic table, physical chemistry, recently. Now, as you speak, right? I haven't done this for years, since I was a biology teacher in the upper grades. Can you think of something more boring to teach than the periodic table? Don't shoot me there. It's boring stuff. Hydrogen, helium, you know, sodium, and knowing the atomic mass. Wait, this is like really boring. You know, I taught these kids that. And at the end of a double period, they came to me and said, please don't send us back to our regular classes. Are you nuts? This is the periodic table. This is not mammalian reproduction. You know, why do you want to go? This is the point, man. I said to teachers at one of the schools here in Cape Town, I said, man, if I just look at your face and how miserable you are coming to the class, no wonder the kids tune out. You know, there's no passion. There's no love for the subject. So it's very important not only to support teachers, well, as you guys were saying, textbooks, it's time, infrastructure, agree with that. But regardless of textbooks, regardless of infrastructure, if I get paid to teach somebody else's child, A, it's a privilege, and B, it's an enormous responsibility, especially when the school is the only way out of poverty. Okay? And this is so important to me. So I think we should look at all the stakeholders here, including teachers, and ask, are we doing everything in our power to keep children engaged in the classroom? As opposed to simply saying, if only I had more data projectors, if only I had more, you know, then the world will change. The world doesn't change like that. And I'm not saying this in a professorial bubble. I'm saying this because I was there, you know, as a teacher, doing experiments with stuff that I had to pay out of my own pocket and hire from steal from UCT, not steal, but I mean borrow from UCT and other schools. So I think this is very, very important. Or the only way you change education, let me just tell you this, is if every one of us in that support role around the children play our respective roles.
And that right there speaks to the crux of what it is that we're speaking about here, which is a whole of society approach to education itself. Prof, you brought up the dreaded Bella Bill, as we'd like to tackle that issue. You brought it up here, and it's a bill itself that seeks to threaten the autonomy of schools themselves, but it also seeks to threaten the role of the community and the role of parents and the role of many other stakeholders from civil society and their role within schools. Solly, so how is it that as a provincial government that we'd actually safeguard our schools and really ensure that communities and that's all the various and relevant stakeholders are actually involved in the learning process to ensure that learners themselves are incentivized to really come to school and have a good time at school and a good experience at school?
You know, unfortunately, this government has all been obsessed about dismantling something that works. And then bringing half-thought, plans that in the long run have failed time and time again. And the Bella Bill is actually one of those. You want to take something that is actually working, because you are failing to address a challenge somewhere else, and then you are then say, because this is not there somewhere, maybe what we now need to then do is to then kill it everywhere else, where communities are actually then getting involved, where you would have SGBs that are actually doing what needs to be done, where there is culture and proudness of a culture. Now, I had a debate with Panyaza Lesuf when he was the MEC of education. I said something. I said, Afrikaans is the only African language that a child can learn from preschool up to a professor level. The only African language. What have we done since the dawn of democracy, as an example, to try and make sure that you are able to then adapt curriculum to be able to then ensure that learners who are learning in Xhosa, learning in Zulu, learning in Sesotho, Sepedi, and all these other indigenous languages are able to then, in their languages, and support curriculum development and translation of that, and ensure that there are teachers who are able to then do that, and ensure that even families who want to then get involved in the teaching or in the wholesome education of a child is able to then do that. Right now, I grew up learning with a book called Renama Homoch as an example. I was able to then learn proper Sepedi from and Sizulu from primary all the way up to high school, and then it ended from there. That I was not able to then learn anything post matric. If I were to then say I wanted to do law, I wanted to do economics, I wanted to do sciences, as an example, I couldn't learn in my mother tongue, or I couldn't learn in a language that I was I'm very much comfortable with at home. Then you talk about how do we then ensure that that is something that we invest in, because you are now saying where this has been the case, where there's been investment in. Let me take that away. Let me take the fact that you have an SGB that looks at them getting involved in the running of a school, keeping a school clean, keeping or donating to to a sporting field, or donating to the boardroom, that you have a boardroom in a school, because you're not having it somewhere. Instead of then saying, how do we build a culture there and enhance that to be able to then do this, you then say, let's kill it. That is not the solution. This is why you will not have a situation where, until such time as you're able to then say, how do we then bring everybody else up to a certain level up, not bring everything down, bring everything up. That's how you're able to then deal with this issue. That's how you're able to then bring equality. That's how you're able to then bring the wholesomeness that the professor is talking to here. And I think this is something that, for me, has been a very lazy way of trying to deal with a problem that is really a problem, but you're looking at the wrong direction in terms of resolving the problem. That's what we now need to be looking at. I can give a number of examples. NHI is but an example of that. You're looking at bringing everything down instead of saying, how do you bring everything else up on the other end where, things have been, going wrong. And I think this is something that when we come in, this is something that we would want to then fight against. We want to then take the fight, to all the stakeholders and say, we want all of you to come in. But understand that you coming in, it means that there will be sacrifices that needs to be done. There will be things that all of us needs to then get involved in. There also needs to be a cultural change. Unfortunately, in certain instances, there needs to be a cultural change of what we understand as a teaching of a child. Because unfortunately, you go into certain township, the teaching of a child is left to a teacher, but it starts at home. It should start at home, and I'm not talking about, only the ability of you to teach a child how to read and write, but also making sure that your child has the time to come in and read and write, and actually somebody to listen and interact with the child when they're doing that. The ability of you participating in your child's education and taking a keen interest in them doing that, participating in the in the wholeness of a school. That is something that needs to be taken into consideration, and this is the culture change that I'm talking to.
So when we look at something like that, you mentioned earlier that governance itself is a massive influencer of what it is that really impacts our culture within our schools and the way in which our schools operate. And Prof, how is it that governance actually does impact our schools? I mean, we often take it for granted that governance is a massive impact, or rather it has a massive impact within basic education itself. But what is the real ramifications of having bad governance within schools? And then what is the positive ramifications of having good governance within our schools?
Do by governance you refer to the SGBs and the parents and all of that?
Correct.
Okay. Look, in an ideal world, right, I think it would be fantastic if parents were fully involved in their schools and make a contribution and and all of that. That's in an ideal world. But again, I live in two realities. I live there's a reality called Pretoria Boys, since you guys are in Swane, and there's a reality called Namalodi High School. There's, what I mean? We need to understand. So in the one setting, you can assume that the parents would give millions of rands to build a new sports field or something. In another setting, the parents are really struggling just to pay the school fees for the lower quintile school fees. So we must be, in the one place, the parents work late at night. The only time they can possibly come into a school governing body, as happened here where I am now, is on a Saturday morning when they're tired and need to do other things as well. It's very, very difficult for parents. That said, it is true, and I've seen this in schools around the country, that even in the poorest communities, when a school turns around, think of the schools, for example, in Umlazi right now, their parents are clamoring to be part of the governing body because the school, think of the school up in the north, one of the best math and science schools in the country, in Toyandou. Of course, people want to have their children, they're proud, So schools have to work much harder, provincial governments have to work much harder, I think, to get parents excited about their schools. But they're not going to get excited unless they see the results. Okay, it's as simple as that. Bear in mind also that in the most difficult areas of our country, and again, I don't want to mention school names here, the children aren't raised by the parents. The children are raised by auntie, the parents are raised by grandmother, and sometimes even they raise themselves. So again, never assume a middle-class notion of a government body, okay, and of parents and parents. Always understand it depends where you are and who you are talking about. But in an ideal world, absolutely. If parents, take the issue of discipline, the issue of getting your child to school on time, the issue of just making sure they dress as if they're going to school and not to a nightclub. I mean, these are the kinds of things in which parents can alleviate much of the stress. Because if they don't, the teacher then becomes a social worker, the teacher becomes the nurse, the teacher becomes the pastor or the priest, the teacher and in addition teach physics. Let me just tell you something. That is, and again, first-hand experience, that's an enormous load on the teacher. And so on. So ideally, yes, but in the absence of active parents, it's tough. Let me tell you something on the teachers.
So when you look at the absence of parents and you look at child-headed households as well, you look at also the weight that then falls upon these children. And what you also find is that there's a lack of influence, a parental influence within the lives of these kids. And what you will then find is that this role obviously or tends to be taken up by individuals such as gangsters or negative elements within society. And we find this then, and we have to find a way to address it. And Solly, as the DA, we have the integrated school safety plan. Speak to that. What is it exactly that then offers against, the factors such as gangsterism and violence within our communities that then inhibit a powerful and a successful and a meaningful learning environment?
Well, look, I think there's quite a number of things there. As I said, one, if you're not talking to the issue of infrastructure, the safety of the infrastructure where learners are learning, you're going to have a problem. Prof, right in the beginning, spoke about a child falling into a pit hole, while going to a toilet and drowning in that. That's a problem. We now need to be talking to that. So when we're talking about the safety of learners, we're not talking about only external elements. We're also talking internal elements within the school premises, to start off with. So let's talk about the kind of infrastructure that we now need to then put in place in order for learners to be able to then have at least the infrastructure that is talking conducive learning. The second part is, how do you get parents? And I hear this notion that we don't have time as parents, but we should make time. The investment of a child, or investment into a child to be able to then progress and do well, is something that all of us should be saying, how do I then assist? And I can tell you right now, I know of great men and women who are giving of their time, because they do have time to then say, I can offer Saturday classes, for learners in maths and science and in English or whatever the case may be. I can give of my time to go and talk to boy kids, in terms of how they behave, as an example, at different schools. I personally go to schools and I speak to matriculants before, the beginning of the year, and I also go to when they're about to go write the exams, because the amount of pressure that they have to deal with, and the preparedness, I'm seeing it firsthand. I used to know about it, but I'm seeing it firsthand now with my own child, my own son, who's now in matric. So I'm saying there's so many parents, and when I'm talking parents, I'm not talking about only the biological, parents of children. I'm talking about anybody in the community that can play a role. Here in Gauteng, as an example, there's been an investment in buying iPads and smart boards in classes. Those things get vandalized, those things get stolen. What are we doing to make sure that there's community members that are able to then assist working kids to school? This is something that we have introduced now, the buddy system in the Western Cape, where learners are able to then, not everywhere, but where it has been introduced, where you're having parents that are able to then walk kids to school in a safe environment. When learners are able to learn in a safe environment, where you don't even have people that are selling illegal things like drugs through the school fence and all of that to learners that are there. We have seen here situation where learners have been sold, cookies that have been laced with drugs. We've seen where, learners that were intoxicated end up stabbing, a principal or a teacher at a school. So these are some of the things that we now need to then say, who become influencers, positive influencers of learners, who are coming to our schools. As I said, it can be parents, but it can also be members of the community who are taking a full-on, role in terms of assisting us with these communities. And I think that begins to then breed a situation where there is learning, that is conducive, but also that enhances, or that I would say enhances the experience and the upbringing of a child. And this is something that, in my mind, is something that has been lacking. How do we incentivize that from a government perspective? I think you also now have a situation where you have school feeding programs. Who are the people who are feeding our kids? Is it that they're just coming in and cooking and then, going? Is there a little bit more that we can do? Is there something that we can invest in them as from a government perspective, and get them to be able to then do much more than just coming, cooking, cleaning, and then going? Are they able to be trained to somehow be able to then, have a positive influence while they're on the grounds of the school on these children? These are some of the things that occupy my mind, and these are some of the things that we would want to then have an engagement with people like Prof, and to then say, is there something that can work? Are we able to then introduce this? How will it work if we were to introduce this, and be able to then make some investments into those kind of things?
And that's something that really is prevalent within our DA policy, is that we don't simplify complex problems, because these are inherently complex problems that require complex solutions to then ensure that we have a holistic way of addressing these problems. Now, Prof, just as a parting shot from yourself, in light of all of this, in light of the context that we find ourselves in South Africa, in light of the very, very different circumstances we find ourselves in relation to other educational institutions across the world, what is the research saying? What are the papers saying? What can you leave us with here today? What is it that is being said about what the best practices within basic education are? And how can we take that in Gauteng and really adapt it and really implement it to ensure that we have a really strong educational sector?
It's very simple, actually. You don't have to do a lot. If I was Sally's MEC for education, I would do a very simple thing and shift politically and materially the focus from grade 12 and put it in the preschool years leading up to grade 1. and strengthen the foundations of those first years of schooling so that by the time a child gets to grade 4, we don't see this horrendous statistic again that 81% of our kids in that grade cannot read for meaning in any language. I mean, this is a tragedy. If I was a president, I would stop everything and say, we are not going to produce a prosperous economy. We are not going to produce a democratic society. We're not going to produce decent citizens unless you fix the foundations of the school system. That's as simple. There's too much attention on this class. There's too much attention on matric camps. There's too much. Focus on building so that by the time a child from a poor community gets to grade 1, they can write their name, they can tell you where they live, they can tell you what work their mother does, they can do what normal kids all over the world do. Okay? Do that. Think Asian. Don't think South African. When you think South African, you want to have quick fixes within an election cycle of 5 years. Think Asian and say, in 30 years, what kind of country will we be building for our children, our grandchildren, and so on? Just do that, and you have a legacy solid.
What Prof is really saying there is that take the name foundation phase seriously. I think that is essentially what you're saying there, Prof. Is that the foundation phase really needs to get the seriousness that it deserves. And Solly, in closing, what is it that we are going to do differently? How are we going to address the crisis that our education sector finds itself with? And how are we going to do so with the DA government in Gauteng?
Well, I think the DA here in Gauteng prides itself with, partnering with the private sector and wanting to have academia coming in, having people in the private sector, people like Prof who are coming from academia and who understand what needs to happen, coming in on board. I think we now need to then change the approach and the thinking. Where government is always, thinking that it knows and can actually provide answers to everything. And now Prof is saying, now look, this model that you have been, applying seemingly is not working. You now need to rethink. And this is the time to rethink the strategy, to rethink resource, allocation, because as Prof has said, we only now competing as to which province is now able to then give us the best metric results. Why we should be then saying which province is able to then push the foundation phase and keeps learners in school, whether you do, as I said, going vocational, going technical, or going, the normal, academia as you have it. What are we doing in that? And because that will tell a different story, that will tell us of a number of things. One, it will tell you what you're investing in and what kind of output you'll get at a later year or later years. That will tell you the kind of economy you will have, because you would have invested in your best resource, your best asset, that is your human capital. You have that invested in, you have that all been worked into, the future that you want to start building in. This is something that I think I'm excited about. And Prof, we will have conversations, going forward. And this is something that I would want, to then take forward, because we have to do it differently. We have to really do things differently. We cannot do the same thing and expect different results. We want to be the best in the world. We want to compete with the best in the world. And it starts with what we're starting off with at the foundation phase for us to be able to then build up to that. And Gauteng is actually very much committed to ensuring that becomes the order of the day going forward.
And that's it. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much, Solly. And more importantly, thank you very much to each and every single person watching this. Like the video. Please ensure that you put in the comments exactly what it is that you think could be done to improve the education sector as a whole. And join us in our next virtual town hall, which will be taking place next week, same time, same place.